Well, welcome back. I really enjoy fellowshipping with everybody at the break, and sometimes it's good just to get into a conversation and hear what your questions are. And sometimes we just get real frank, don't we? We just talk about relationships, and it's okay to get a little emotional in those conversations. And our heart's desire is to show God's love to people, and a lot of the times, it can be easier to maybe meet a stranger on a plane and show God's love to them than it is to show God's love to somebody that we live with day in or day out, or somebody that we have to interact with, and the enemy likes to come and he likes to get us so focused on ourselves, or so focused on not having all the answers, or so focused on not being well enough equipped. And while the purpose of the church is to equip the saints, and that's our goal, that's our heart, that's what we want to do, man, I tell you what, the enemy is the god of distraction. And he can just throw so much at us that takes our mind off the simple goal of just bearing witness to the gospel. Well, in 2019, we're not going to talk about this too much this morning, but I want to do this, and since I know Michelle is out there in the ether listening, she can put a link to this book on this post. But we're going to start out our series on where we got our Bible and all of those things. We had a Circle Sunday a couple of weeks back, and you guys here, you really encouraged me not to leave anything out. I mean, if this is a set of series that we're going to do in 2019, it is the way it is because your feedback and your input to me was that you really wanted me to start at the ground level and build it up and then kind of subdivide it so people could jump in at different points. But one of the things that I've seen that many of you have told me, so I'm not making fun of anybody, I'm actually going off things you've shared with me, but that, so when I say this, I really don't mean it how it's going to sound, but some of you say you struggle to think logically. And so we're going to do a brief semi-series, small series, 3 or 4 sessions on logical thinking and what that means as kind of a precursor to all the stuff we want to cover next year as far as where we got our Bible and all of that kind of stuff. And so it might be a little bit more academic, but I know that being able to find logical fallacies in people's minds and arguments when you're talking about the faith and how to kind of unpack that and how to be able to not twist people's words, that's not what I mean, but be able to take that and then to springboard off of it to help them better understand a logical or a critically reasoned point of view is a skill set that can be taught, but it's not something that everybody grew up doing it. And so because of that, we have a tendency to reason emotionally, and in the field of logical debate, that's just not a thing. So for those of you that are here, I have purchased this book by Dr. Jason Lisle that is called Discerning Truth. Michelle can pop a link to this on Amazon if you want to buy it there, or you want an ebook version of it. But I've pre-bought them for you so that in the coming weeks, you can purchase it. And I'm going to be teaching kind of based from this, but I'm going to be doing my best. I mean, the author of this book, I'm not going to lie to you, he's an astrophysicist by trade. So it's not that it's a very easy book to read, but maybe some of his choices of words in the sense of communicating don't always bring it home. So I wanted to give you some time to become familiar with the relatively simple material that's in here. But then what I'm going to attempt to do is try to land it in some really maybe homespun and easy to grasp ways. But I kind of wanted you to give you a little runway, a little room to grab a hold of these. So if you want one to take home with you, you can see it's not very thick. It's pretty easy from that standpoint. To kind of begin to give you a basis, to give you a little bit of homework and just some time to study. It's a good thing. You got teenagers and high schoolers in your house. This is definitely something that they need to learn and wrap their minds around. So we're going to do this, and I've got maybe 10 of these here And anybody who wants one, I know sometimes it's nice to have a paper book, and you can make some notes, and you can take some thoughts, and you can work your way through it. So that's going to be your homework assignment for about the next month or so. To get a hold of that, to dive into that, and then we can discuss and ask questions and talk about as we kind of unpack it together in future upcoming sessions. So know that those are there. Talk to me about them after the break, or get your own copy of it if you got a Kindle or whatnot, and begin to dive in, because you guys have confessed to me that maybe it's not necessarily all of your strong suit, and I want to equip you to get through it. But for the duration of our time together this morning, I want to go to Matthew chapter 2. We're going to be looking at some other verses, but this one we're just kind of going to read. Matthew chapter 2 takes place after Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now, I know with all of our fun little nativity scenes that we have, we've got the shepherds on this side, and we've got the three wise men on this side, and Mary and Joseph in the middle. I remember growing up in church, the church that my family got saved in did a live nativity scene every year for Christmas, which was just basically people standing out in the cold, standing very still, and being a nativity scene, and my mom would, for some reason, got stuck being the angel and was up on top and had to stand still. And I remember all that, And you think of that perfect little scene, and you don't think about the fact that realistically, the people that we refer to as the three kings or the three wise men, they didn't show up until after Jesus was born. That's what Matthew chapter 2 is all about. And it's about a whole lot more than what we have reduced down to this trite little Christmas story. And that's kind of what I want to share with you a little bit. And in so doing, I'm going to pull out a couple of things that you probably didn't necessarily know before. So let's read a little bit, and then I'm going to fill it back in with some detail. Verse 1 says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem." Now, I am going to refer to these guys as the Magi. And the reason that I'm going to do that, I'm not going to call them the wise men. I'm not going to call them the three kings. The reason I'm going to refer to them as the Magi is because that is the word in the Greek. The word in the Greek is magoi, okay? And it's plural. It is not three. It could be 3. It could be 50. We don't know how many were there. Now, my investigations into history lead me to lean towards scholars who believe it was more of an entourage than that. You're going to see why in a little bit. But we're going to call them the Magi. Now, it's important that you realize right off the bat that that's where we get our word magician in English. That's where this comes from in the Greek, this group, this people called the Magi. A lot of people today think that the Magi's bent, their thing, their skill set, if you will, was astrology. That these were individuals who watched the stars and studied the signs in the heavens, and so they discovered this new light in the stars, and that led them to Bethlehem of Judea, to where this king was supposed to be born. That wasn't their bag. The Magi were a group of Persian wise men. They go back a long time, and their bread and butter, so to speak, goes all the way back to Babylon, but it wasn't astrology that made them famous. It was oniromancy, and I know all of you have used that word 5 times this morning before breakfast. Oniromancy is the interpretation of dreams, okay? That's what these people were known for centuries prior to them showing up in Matthew chapter 2. I'll prove that to you in Scripture in a minute. They were gifted with the interpretation of dreams. Now, let's go a little bit further in the Word before I build this one out. Okay. So they came from the east. They came to Jerusalem saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." And the scribes and the Pharisees there are quoting the Old Testament prophet Micah in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Now what's interesting from this standpoint is these guys, the Magi, they obviously weren't familiar with the prophecy in Micah 5, chapter 2. They didn't know that this king was supposed to be born in Bethlehem, even though hundreds of years before Jesus was born, it was prophesied specifically where he would be born. And so instead, they see this star from where they're at in the east, and they follow it not to Bethlehem, but they follow it to Jerusalem. And when they get to Jerusalem, where all the hoity-toity scribes and Pharisees make their headquarters, they start asking, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" Now, in America today, man, we're obsessed with politics, right? It's always going on all around us. It's something that's in our minds. With the country, everybody's talking about how polarized the country is. But we know very little about the politics that were going on behind the scenes during the time of Jesus' birth. So I want to show you a map, and I've got this up. That we can put it on the screen. Here it is. I am showing you what was going on. Now, talk a little bit about traditions. These wise men, this note that we get 3 wise men, comes from maybe the 3rd century. Not even the time of Christ. And the reason we start thinking that there's 3 is because they brought what? 3 gifts, right? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It's the only reason that we say that there was 3 of them. Because, it wasn't going to be a bunch of dudes that only brought 3 gifts. That's like crashing a party and only bringing, 1 bag of chips, 1 bag of soda. Bag of soda. Haven't you seen that? It's like boxed wine, only worse. All right. Nobody asked you, Tracy. All right. By the 6th century, these guys had names. And some even associate them with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the 3 sons of Noah, and thus Asia, Africa, Europe. They begin trying to assimilate the world as coming before Jesus. And as of the 14th century AD, they get named Belshazzar, the king of Arabia, Melchior, the king of Persia, and Gaspar, the king of India. Nowhere is any of that anywhere in the Bible. These guys came from the east, and I'm giving you kind of an overview here on this map of some political divisions that existed in 1st century AD up to and just prior to Jesus coming into the world. Now, for those of you that aren't necessarily familiar with this part of the world, you can see on the left-hand side there, I've got the delineation of the Roman Empire, right? And then on the eastern side of the map, south of that big yellow area called the Kingdom of Armenia, I've got what is called the Parthian Empire, okay? And above that, we got that Kingdom of Armenia. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But I want to break this down in another map and show you, okay, the big beige area at the bottom. How many know you never want to show up as beige on a map? That's like the worst, most boring country color you can have. You want to be better than that. All right, so this beige area, you got the Parthian Empire. And then you can see the Armenian Empire stretches out above that, and then Rome would have been to the west here. And way down in the lower left-hand corner, you can see Judea, right? And if you look very carefully, you'll be able to see Jerusalem. Now, what was taking place is you had these two massive political powers vying for control of these regions of the planet, pretty much a lot of what is now Turkey. The Parthian Empire was one of the leading opposition forces to the Roman Empire. So when we have, like we did on the first map, these groups between us, there were all of these battles that were taking place between Rome and Parthia. And they would go back and forth. And so the Kingdom of Armenia and the little tiny province known as Palestine, Galilee, and Judah became buffer zones, right? They became contested territories that created a buffer area from these two empires colliding with each other. And so in the days before Jesus was born, the years before Jesus was born, this territory went back and forth. The first Roman conqueror of Jerusalem attacked this area of Armenia in 63 BC. In 55 BC, Roman legions sacked Jerusalem, and then in a subsequent attack, they moved from Jerusalem over into that Parthian Empire and attacked over there, trying to expand the Roman Empire. Roman rule was established under the guy who preceded King Herod. His name was Antipater. And that guy wound up having to retreat from the Parthians who invaded Jerusalem and Galilee and Judea and pushed back against the Romans trying to take over their territory as early as 40 years before Jesus was born. Now, here's a name most of us will know from history, and we don't even realize this, but how many of you heard the story about Cleopatra and Mark Antony, right? So Herod the Great, the guy that was king when Jesus was born, it wasn't just Julius Caesar, it wasn't just Mark Antony, that whole romance that Shakespeare wrote upon. Herod had his foot in that thing too. He tried to win Cleopatra's affection. And in 37 BC, Mark Antony established Roman sovereignty back in the area of Israel, and then decided he's going to push even further into Parthia to drive the Roman enemies back. But it resulted in a disastrous defeat, followed by another wave of the Parthians invading and retaking the territory. So much so that Herod the Great had to flee out of Israel and go set up camp in Alexandria, Egypt for a number of years. And then from then, when things didn't work out with that whole schmoozing thing he was trying to have go on down there in Egypt, he went back to Rome to convince Caesar to make him the king of the Jews. He got Caesar Augustus to make him the king of the Jews, proclaim him. The problem was Herod wasn't a Jew. He was an Edomite. And for those of you that don't remember, Edomite, that came from Esau. Jacob's line became the Jewish people, and Esau, Jacob's brother, became the Edomites. And they've been at war all through the Old Testament, right? And Herod's desire was to be proclaimed the king of the Jews, even though he wasn't a Jew by heritage. And so Caesar Augustus decides, I'm going to name you the king of the Jews. Now think about that. When these magi showed up, what were they asking? Where is he who was born King of the Jews? Let me tell you what, there is a big difference between being proclaimed King of the Jews and having that title by birthright. Big difference. Because the Jews would rise up and revolt to have somebody who was actually from the house of David instead of a puppet king set in place and named the King of the Jews by a Roman emperor. See what I'm saying? But not only that, these magi came from the east in this area called Parthia. They came to Jerusalem and they started asking, where's he that has been born King of the Jews? This opposing emperor, the wise men, the magicians, who were already seeking a king because the emperor of Parthia had died and they were in the process of looking for who the new ruler was going to be. And of course, that new ruler would probably want to cut his teeth on another invasion, right? And so when they show up in force, that's why it says that it scared Herod, because the last time they got kicked out, when Mark Antony failed, Herod had to flee to Alexandria, Egypt, and then he had to flee to Rome, and he didn't even get to occupy his capital city for years before he could actually take Jerusalem and set up camp there as the King of the Jews. It took a 5-month siege by Roman troops to take Jerusalem back from the Parthians before Herod could go and say, Caesar Augustus said, I'm the king here. That is some tumultuous political conspiracies going on. Now, who were these guys called the Magi? Now, if you go back to Daniel, and you go to Daniel chapter 2, you're going to get a quick look at who these people were. It says, now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that sleep left him. Verse 2, then the king gave the command to call the what? The magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretations, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. And they answered again, said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. And the king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time is changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. And they say it's a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy the wise men of Babylon. And so the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men and sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. This group of Babylonian wise men is the same group. They came from Babylon. The same group of people, and they were being killed because they couldn't do their job of interpreting dreams, because the king had the request that they would have to tell him the dream before he knew that they had the right interpretation. And Daniel famously goes down in history, while other magi are already being killed, he says, I can do what the king has asked for me to do. And he proceeds to tell the king the dream and then give the interpretation. Later on in the story of Daniel, one of the reasons that the whole conspiracy over the lion's den takes place is because Daniel had had so much clout and so much influence over the Babylonian magi that when the Persians took over, Babylon was wiped out as an empire. The Persians came from the east and they engulfed the Magi and elevated the Magi and mixed the Magi with their Persian religion. Daniel found himself in the same place again, and he ascended with King Darius to a point of influence, not in one empire, but in two empires. And that's why all of the Magi at that time, they conspired. They wanted to wipe Daniel out. Of course, we know that didn't go well for him, right? And because of this, Daniel had a hallmark throughout time that he instilled in this cloistered group of these wise men known for the interpreting of dreams. That one day something was going to happen that they needed to pay attention to. Now, how far back does this really go? How many of you remember the story of Balaam and Balak? Took place when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt and they were moving through the land of the Moabites. And Balak was a Moabite ruler, and much like the Edomites and some of the other tribes outside of the promised land, they didn't want to give passage to the Israelites to come through their land, and so they decided to go out and to attack them. And Balak, he requested the services of a man who hailed near Babylon, named Balaam. And what did he want Balaam to do? He wanted him to curse the Israelites. And no matter how much Balaam tried, God wouldn't let curses for the Israelites come out of his mouth. This is the story, for those of you that can't remember, that Balaam is riding to go where he's supposed to go, and his donkey turns one way and he gets mad at it, and he turns the other way and he gets mad at it. His donkey turns around and talks to him. Says, why do you strike me? There's an angel in the path. And if I hadn't turned, the angel would have struck you and killed you. We think that's a miracle. I say God talks out of the mouths of donkeys all the time. Look at Congress. Okay. The reality that we see here is it goes all the way back, and I want to show you something. I can tie these two together. Go to Numbers chapter 24. We're going to look at verse 17. This is one of the promises that was made. This is one of the blessings that Balaam had no choice but to speak over Israel. Numbers 24, verse 17. And the utterance of him who hears the words of God, I'm in verse 16 right now, kind of catching up, and has the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, who falls down with eyes wide open. Verse 17, Balaam speaks. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. Who's he talking about? The Messiah, the coming one. Messiah ben Yosef, Messiah ben David. He's prophesying about the Messiah. And in verse 17, he says, a star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel and batter the brow of Moab, which of course Balak didn't like because he was a Moabite king, right? And destroy all the sons of tumult. And Edom shall be a possession. Seir also, his enemies, shall be a possession, while Israel does valiantly. Out of Jacob one shall have dominion and destroy the mains of the city. But did you see that line? A star shall come out of Jacob. If you go to Genesis 49, there's another place, an ancient prophecy uttered by Jacob himself over his son Judah. Verse 8 of Genesis 49 says, Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion who shall rouse him. Verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. And the scepter spoke of the reign that the king of Israel, the leadership of Israel, should always come from the tribe of Judah, which is David's tribe, the house of David, comes through. And what a lot of people don't know is do a lot of political machinations that were going on very near the same time of all the things I've shared with you with these Parthian kingmakers coming to Jerusalem. Just prior to this, Rome had robbed Israel of the very right to enforce capital punishment. And so that's why in Jesus' time, they had to bring Jesus before Pilate, because Rome no longer had, or Israel no longer had the right to rule over itself and to enforce capital punishment in their time. And history, secular history, records that when the Roman governor and the Caesar made that decision, that the Pharisees wept because they said the scepter had fallen from Judah and the Messiah had not yet come. Of course, they didn't realize that just down the road in a little hamlet named Bethlehem, a baby boy had just been born in a manger. And that a prophecy had been fulfilled. Do you see how rife the times when Jesus was born was going to be? And that is why when this entourage comes saying, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" Herod is terrified. But while these men perhaps knew with the prophecy in Genesis 49, while these men perhaps knew of an ancestor named Balaam, an ungodly prophet, forced by the Spirit of God to speak godly words and say a star would come out of Jacob, and they knew where to look. They didn't know about a prophecy in Micah chapter 5. So they come to Jerusalem and they ask, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" And the scribes and the Pharisees, they look and they uncover and they search all of their scrolls. And they heard that he was supposed to be born in Bethlehem from what Micah said. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 2. I'm coming to the end. Verse 7 says, "Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star had appeared. So he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also.' And when they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was." Now, I also want to make something. I'm not going to take the time to go into it because it's not the point that I want to prove in this morning's message. But a lot of people, there's even been DVDs made where people try to buy astronomical charts and softwares, and they try to tell us it was a confluence of Venus and all these strange things. Let me tell you what. No star in the heavens moves in a southerly direction. They were in Jerusalem, and it says the star they were following moved and went south to stand over where baby Jesus had lived. He wasn't in a manger anymore. The Bible records that he was now in a house in Bethlehem. But stars don't move south. They move east to west, right? What could it have been that they were following? I'm just going to put this out there, let you ponder it, let you think about it. If you follow the same story of what took place in the days of the prophets, once upon a time, before Israel went into captivity, there was a shining glory that hung out over the Holy of Holies. And Herod the Great had so desired to make himself respectable to the Jews that he had rebuilt the second temple, built in Nehemiah's day and built in Ezra's day. And he had made it lavish to the point that it was almost 22 stories tall, and it was covered with gold, and it was one of the wonders of the known world. But it was missing something that Solomon's temple never had. The Shekinah glory of God had departed from the first temple in the days of Ezekiel. And it had left Israel. I'm pretty sure if you look it up, it had gone to the east. My suggestion to you is that these men, they saw the glory of God. The pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. And it moved in. And instead of settling over Herod's false temple, it moved south. It settled over Jerusalem. Or it settled over Bethlehem. And it dwelt over he who was the glory of God incarnate. So what happens when they get there? Let's read this together. I want you to see this part of the story. It says, "And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house," see, he's in a house at this time. He's no longer in a manger. It's much time after, maybe as much as 2 years. "They saw the young child with Mary his mother and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Then being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way." Now, why is that verse so important? Because what was their skill set? Interpreting of dreams. So we see it lined up all throughout the scripture. In other words, what God was doing with these magi, he began in Numbers. And it begins to work its way through the fabric of history to the Babylonian Empire, where God, even when Israel is in sin and has them in captivity, he has someone. Do you know something that was very special about Daniel, different than the other prophets? He came from the line of Judah. He was not just a priest. He was in the line of the king. He came from that tribe. And then the Persians take over, and embedded in their history is a man who is capable of doing what they were known to do, but 1,000 times better, or maybe more appropriate, the way the book of Daniel replies, is 10 times better, right? And they remembered him, and they remembered their leadership, and there came a time when they remembered a promise. They remembered that a star would come out of Jacob in a time when their empire was looking for a king. They came to this king and they brought gifts, and I assure you these gifts were bountiful. And I want to remind you real quick as we get ready to wrap this up. Prior to the wise men showing up, when we see Mary and Joseph coming to Bethlehem, they didn't have room for expensive lodging. When the inn was full, they had to go to the manger. When 8 days later they went to the temple to present Jesus at the temple, they couldn't afford the lamb. They had to buy the turtle doves. They barely had enough money to get to where they needed to go. But as we know from the story, when the wise men, when the magi don't report back to Herod, he knows that they sussed him out and they figured he was lying. And so, of course, Herod decides to kill every male Jewish child in Bethlehem from the age of 2 on down. And in another dream, an angel warns Joseph and says, take the boy and his mother and go where? Go to Egypt. Did you ever ask the question how they, as aliens in a country, were able to live in Egypt for as long as it took for Herod to die? How they were able to afford the trip to get there? Moreover, we see Joseph show up one more time when Jesus is 12 years old, but did you ever ask yourself after he disappeared? We know that they had more children, right? That Jesus had brothers and sisters. We know because Jesus' one brother became the head of the church of Jerusalem, right? How did a young widow, how does the Bible paint widows? Poor, destitute, the church is supposed to take care of them. Remember the widow's mite? She didn't have a lot, did she? How did a young widow continue to raise as many as 6 children and not have to get remarried? You ever take the time to think about that? Jesus never had a place to lay his head. And there's people like to say that he took a vow of poverty. But the Bible says that the disciples had a treasury, right? It even says that Judas consistently stole from the treasury, but he was able to do it in such a way that they didn't outright notice. And let me tell you, you notice, like if you got $10,000 in the bank, you might not notice $10 going missing. You know what I'm saying? But if you got $100 in the bank, you're going to pay attention when $10 goes missing, right? How come Judas was able to steal from the treasury consistently for the period of time he was with the disciples and not get caught? I'm not saying Jesus didn't know he was doing it. Jesus let Judas do what he was doing, but how come the other disciples didn't catch him? How come Jesus was able to have 12 disciples or more following him around and yet have food and have places to stay? How come yes, he was an itinerant rabbi. Yes, he didn't have a home base other than Peter's mother-in-law's house. Yes, Bethany outside of Jerusalem, there's people but how come he could afford to do that? Because starting with Balaam and going through Babylon and going through Persia, the God of this world created the means by which the Messiah would be taken care of, would be protected in Egypt, would be raised and able to go about his ministry. For centuries. Because when Jesus stepped out of glory and into humanity and humbled himself, God already had the plan in place to make what he had asked his son to do possible. And it didn't matter the political machinations that were going on around the world. It didn't matter that the empires of the known world were battling it out for control of a tiny little speck of land. It didn't matter that there was a man on the throne who was called king but wasn't king. God had embedded the seeds of protection and prosperity and provision for centuries before Jesus ever showed up on the planet, because those men who were forever influenced by Daniel's life would know that a star would come out of Jacob, and when they come, they would worship. Have you ever thought about it that way? In the first session this morning, we talked about what if we remember to stay in a place where we're willing to hear the Lord's voice. And even though we're tired, and even though we're possibly hurting, and even though we're fighting our way through, that it is a sign to us that Jesus entered into the world in a manger, in humility, without riches, without wealth. Remember, my friends, Jesus' robe was valuable enough that Roman soldiers didn't want to rip it, so they gambled for who would get to own it. My friends, if you will obey God, if you will trust in the Lord, if you will step out humbly, not knowing where it's going to go, not knowing how you're going to speak to someone who doesn't even speak your language, not knowing necessarily what all the answers are going to be when you have to step out in that faith, let me tell you what, your great big God has had the provision for you to do his will in your life, lined up, set apart, set in place, ready to go for centuries before you were even born. That doesn't mean you're going to have a bright new shiny yacht. That doesn't mean you're going to live in a mansion. It means that God will take care of you, because if he can take care of Jesus, if he can orchestrate the empires of the world to have everything come together at just the right time to get gold and frankincense and myrrh to a baby in a manger, he can feed you. He can clothe you. He can take care of you. He can balance your checkbook. He can handle the things that you need. He can take care of your emotional needs. He can take care of and protect you in the face of your enemies, even if it means putting you in a place for a season that is away from where you thought you were supposed to be. And he can provide for you while you're there. That's why Jesus says, don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about where your clothes will come from. Don't worry about where your food. He says, even the lily of the valleys is dressed better. Because he knew that his Father had taken care of him, had set him up for ministry, had set him up for success. Jesus and the Father don't set you up for failure. They set you up to succeed. I'm going to close with this thought. A lot of people don't realize this, but the gifts that were given were also prophetically symbolic. Gold spoke to Jesus' kingship, the wealth of a king. Frankincense was a type of incense. It's a sap that comes from a tree, and it was used as part of the incense that was used in priestly offerings. So it spoke not to Jesus' kingship, but to his priesthood. Myrrh, also a sap, is a fragrant ointment, but it only releases its fragrance when it's crushed. We're going to go to Isaiah 60, verse 6. It only releases its fragrance when it's crushed, and it spoke to his death and his burial. Isaiah 60, verse 6 is a prophetic scripture that talks about Jesus' second coming. I'm going to start in verse 5, we'll get to verse 6. It says, then you shall see and become radiant, and your heart shall swell with joy, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the Gentiles shall come to you. Verse 6, the multitude of camels shall cover your land, the dromedaries of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. Pay attention here. It says, they shall bring gold and incense, and they shall proclaim the praises of the Lord. How come when Jesus comes back the second time, there's only two gifts? Gold and incense, or what the text says is frankincense. It's because he's already died. And he can only die one time. See, here's the thing. Even in his second coming, the Father is already preparing for the Son. And this is the thing that you need to realize. When the gifts come, God only gives you what you need. He doesn't have to give you a gift that you're not going to have to use. That first time he came, he needed that myrrh because his death was still before him. The second time he comes, he is the eternal, the ever-living, the bright and morning star. And he's not going to need that gift. My friends, if we can humble our hearts and recognize that God is so good at preparing the way before. I mean, I haven't even tapped on the fact that he sent John the Baptist ahead of him, right? If we can humble our hearts and just say, we don't even begin to stack up to Jesus. We're not even close to Jesus. He's the Savior of the world. And on our best day, all we can do is hope to share with someone the good news of the gospel of what Jesus has done. But Lord, if you can prepare the way for Jesus, then I can put enough faith in you to know that you are going to prepare the way for me. I can think of that Jesus in a manger as a sign that the Christ has come, and that if I step out humbly in faith of what you've asked me to do, that you're going to have my back once I'm out on a limb. Does that make sense? Let's close with prayer. Father God, it is so easy to turn on the news, to check our Facebook feed, to listen to the radio, whatever it may be, and to get totally consumed with everything that is taking place in the world around us. It is so easy to see ourselves in a hovel and think we'll never be in a home. It is so easy to be obsessed with the things that make us anxious, the things that oppress us, the things that depress us. Lord, if we could just see as a sign that you stepped from greatness into squalor, that you stepped from prosperity into humility, that you wrapped yourself in swaddling clothes and lay in a feeding trough for cattle, that God, we can step out humbly, we can trust you, but at the same time, we can know that you provide for those you love, you care for those you love, you have our backs. Your word says you will be our rear guard. Your word says that you will surround our very lives. There is so much good news with the gospel. It's embedded in every story, and it doesn't matter how many political machinations are going on. It doesn't matter how many empires are at war. It doesn't matter how many fake kings pretend to the throne. You are the one true King, Jesus. And if you can do all of that to get your sacrifice for the sins of man on this planet, to be able to minister to us, to be able to show us that your will is to heal, to be able to show us that your goal is to not judge the world, but save the world, to show us that in you we can have eternal life, and that your command for us is to go forth and to share that truth with everybody we come into contact with, then God, we can rest in the knowledge that if we humble ourselves in our sight, you will lift us up. You have prepared the way for us. You have a plan for us to walk out. You have a path for us to follow, and you will guide us to it as surely as you put a star in the sky for the Magi. If you can lead men that don't even claim to know you, then you can lead those who have given you their lives. May our ears be attentive in this season in which we remember you. The people of God said,